would be some self-reflection and preparation for yourself as you think about your application. So I'll go into these in a bit more detail from the Canadian perspective. So just to kind of highlight residency programs in Canada, currently there's 14 therapy programs. There's many more centers involved in those programs, since some of our programs are kind of joint programs. So the BC Cancer Agency has multiple centers within their residency program. Same for the Northern Ontario School of Medicine program, Thunder Bay and Sudbury, and then the University of Toronto program has 5 comprehensive cancer centers as the program. So the numbers don't necessarily align with the programs. There's also 2 imaging programs, variable starting dates, variable funding schema across all of the centers, and limited match participation, as probably many of you are aware. So I think we were up to about 5 programs in the match last year. One of those programs is a Canadian program, but is also actually accredited through a US program. So Windsor Regional Cancer Center in Ontario is part of Carmanos, I believe, and Wayne State program maybe in the US. So, it is quite a variable landscape in how we're accredited or the application process. And even those centers in the match do not often use the common application system, the MPRAP. And also variability in program characteristics. So that's another part of your preparation in terms of information gathering. So majority of the programs in Canada are 2 years, but good to know the length of the program and how we implement the campus standards into practice across the programs, because there are a lot of variations in rotations, classes that may be part of the programs, what the QC duties may or may not be, clinical projects, evaluations or assessments, and kind of the different levels of supervision or mentorship that may be required in the program. So all useful information for you to gather as much as you can ahead of time through conversations with former lab mates, people at conferences, or also website-based research. Also may be helpful context-wise to understand kind of the candidate pool in Canada. It can be quite, from experience, variable in size and depth. So it's good to know that there's only a specific number of graduate programs in Canada, and same with certificate programs. So those are where most of our candidates come from. The number from year to year can vary greatly. The majority of successful applicants in Canada are PhD. Some programs will accept masters. I would say it is unusual, and it's also then kind of very exceptional master's candidates. So usually you need kind of some extra experience or something to set you apart. And part of that is also many of the programs you talk to really the likelihood of getting a job after residency in Canada without a PhD can be difficult. So often you want to ensure as a program that your residents will be employable afterwards. And there's also some retention goals of Canadian residents to stay in Canada after. So we are kind of mindful of employability afterwards, and we want to make sure we set residents up to be successful. And often that tends to be PhD candidates. Most of our candidate pool is also, for most centers, limited to Canadian citizens or permanent residents. And often that's tied to kind of funding eligibility as well. So most programs I'm aware of don't support kind of visas in any way. So that also limits our candidate pool. So it's potentially a much different candidate pool than US centers. So just something to keep in mind when you're thinking of how competitive it might be. So moving from that, that's kind of a first step towards self-reflection. So thinking in your preparation for your application, really like, why do you want to do a clinical residency? What are your goals during or after residency? What type of program may help you achieve that? And what makes you a strong candidate? And trying to kind of highlight some of these things that can help you prioritize where you apply to, what type of features of a program you're looking for. Other factors could be, how you balance kind of location or work-life balance with program as well could all be things that you should think about before you start applying. So the residency application itself, really from a program perspective, a really brief perspective from mine is we're really looking at this package to establish your eligibility, make sure you're suitable for the program and you meet all kind of eligibility requirements. And really we're just looking to create a short list. So looking at your academic experience and trying to make an assessment of clinical research potential, and hopefully gathering any insights into how you may work in a clinical environment or a team environment. So tip number one for your application in terms of preparation is also to consider your audience. There's different size centers, different size programs. So make sure you're writing it appropriately. Consider how much of an academic center it might be or a clinical center. And also then have multiple people review it, proofread. I think, application review can be pretty subjective at times, but one perspective may be that it's a detail-oriented at times field. So having your cover letter addressed to the right program, if it's not a common application form, is a little thing that is a nice detail to ensure it is correct when you're applying. Ensure your eligibility is clear. So if you are still pending graduation from one of your degrees, make sure any dates of your graduation are provided if possible. If you're not from a camp-ed program, but feel you meet all of the eligibility requirements, say from the non-direct pathway, please comment on that in your cover letter and make us, sure that we know how to assess your application in a clear manner, make it as easy as possible. I'd also consider in your cover letter, consider proactively addressing any question areas of your application. So again, that could be eligibility. It could be something about, a gap in your training. It could be kind of a career change move, what motivated that. It's helpful to give us insight into the candidate if you address that upfront. CV tips specifically, a standard academic format always works well. Make key metrics accessible as much as possible. Simply numbering your number of publications instead of a bullet point is something that I would suggest. Longer does not always mean better. We don't expect you to have extensive clinical experience. Personally, in most of our programs in Canada, I would say in general, we don't expect you to have tons of clinical experience coming out of graduate school. You have exposure to the camp-ed grad curriculum. I don't necessarily need a detailed list of every kind of technique you've observed or every QC task you have done. And another repetition is if we have your kind of your thesis title and your papers, I also don't need a summary necessarily of your work in a research experience section. If we want to delve more deeper into your research, we're capable of looking at your abstracts and getting a good summary that way as well. So it just makes it easier to really hone down on the information we need to make our initial assessment if it's clear, as concise as possible and not kind of over repetitive with the same things mentioned in a couple different sections. So that's just our perspective. References, ask early, think about the appropriateness of your reference. Don't hesitate to suggest things that they could comment on. If you've done some self-reflection and you know that a certain aspect of your project is maybe unique or you think would serve well, or you have some collaboration that you think has been really unique in your project, ask your references to comment on how that went or how you handled it, and maybe not just focus on reiterating kind of what your project was or how it was, especially if some of your strengths are not necessarily clear numbers of publications, but more how you work with others and how you think you'll function in a clinical environment. That can be really nice if that is addressed either in your cover letter or in your references. For the residency interview, I think tips to know right away is the interviewers want you to have good interview. We don't want it to be bad. We're rooting for everyone to do a good job. So that's maybe helpful to know going in. Benefits and there's kind of benefits and disadvantages to both programs and individuals who are interviewing, depending on the format of the interview, whether it's in person or virtual, and it's not going to be perfect. And there's also, some people thrive more, I find, in virtuals than in person, and vice versa for the people who are doing the interviews. So I think we just have to kind of accept that about the process. We are looking at, in the interview process, at your communication skills, some idea of interpersonal skills, and also really the readiness for residency and your job awareness. So do you know what you're getting into? Will we be able to meet your expectations as our program? And are your expectations or awareness about the job moving forward enough that you know what you're getting into, and we're not going to run into any issues in terms of kind of not knowing the landscape, I guess, or not knowing kind of what the field really is, and having disconnect because you've gotten into something that's maybe not a good not suitable for you or the best direction for you. And that could even be, understanding whether you want to go to therapy or imaging residency. So in terms of preparation for the interview, identify and consider the format of the interview in advance, just panels, one-to-one, small group, faculty versus current residents. That can feed into the comment about kind of professional appearance or approach to the interview for a virtual interview. For example, I still have a hard time sometimes multiple screens, and when you're presenting, where to look, you're looking at your slides versus not the camera. Same thing in advance. Prepare in advance for your interview. Know where to look. Don't have multiple screens. Manage your time in terms of a presentation if you have one, or also your questions that you may ask. Try and, you don't want extremely brief interview answers, but you want to balance that with taking too much time as well, to be mindful of the time you're taking. Be ready to be surprised with a question. There's a lot of standard questions, but there also may be questions that you didn't anticipate and you don't have the answer to. There isn't always, or most often, there isn't a right answer necessarily. So don't worry necessarily about not having an immediate answer or not having what you think is the correct answer. So just be prepared to be surprised and have methods or tools to address that as you go through a question so it doesn't throw you off. Have multiple examples or stories ready for your interview that you can draw on for different types of questions. Be mindful of communication and interpersonal skills throughout. Try and engage with the interviewers as much as possible, and don't be afraid to share enthusiasm or your personality, because that's really something that we can see. We want to, I think residency, especially in Canada, where it can be, like I've said, a small candidate pool, recruitment for physics positions can be difficult as well. So really, residency is often a 2-year job interview, and having someone already at your center as a resident is potentially your best recruitment tool afterwards as well. You're not always guaranteed a job. They don't come up, but it's a good starting point. So we want to not only find someone we think will be successful in our residency and a great candidate, we're also looking for someone who we can envision as a future colleague or coworker. And that's something we're looking for, and that might help if you are enthusiastic in your interview, and also give us insight into who you are as a person or a potential colleague. So really brief preparation, I think, is key. Success in the match or the residency job search is definitely not going to be the same for everyone. We all have different goals. And I think that's important to note. It's an imperfect process. We don't always get, the best, we could choose not to rank an incredible potential resident. And same for us. It's not going to be perfect and we can miss things. Ask questions throughout the process, avoid assumptions. Always ask questions. And I guess I will end by saying good luck in your search, and I look forward to the discussion afterwards.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Dr. McNiven. That was super engaging. For the purpose of time, please save your questions to the end of the discussion. And Dr. Dieterich, if you want to start sharing your screen, I'll give you a quick introduction as well. All right, so Dr. Sonja Dieterich is a full professor and physics residency co-director at the University of California, Davis. She started her medical physics career with heavy ions, protons, and cyberknife. So naturally, her current clinical focus is brachytherapy and the gamma knife. Dr. Dieterich thinks that the best part about being an educator is seeing her trainees and mentees figure out what they want in their career, then going out and achieving those goals. So please feel free to unmute and start your presentation. Oh, I think you're still on mute right now.
Yeah, I couldn't unmute while sharing for some reason. Okay, I'll share again. Okay. No, come on. Okay. Dr. McNiven and I have not coordinated, but it seems to flow pretty well. So I'm a professor in physics residency co-director at UC Davis, that is near Sacramento in California. I also have a disclaimer, as you've heard before, that programs and program directors are very diverse. So
Sonja, sorry, you're not sharing your screen. We don't see it if you're planning on doing that.
Thank you. I did. Is it working now?
Awesome, we can see it now.
Yeah,
oh, okay, yeah. Interesting. Anyway, so programs and program directors are very diverse, and I'm providing naturally just one of many perspectives. And as Dr. McNiven did, I'm trying to generalize as much as possible. Oops, and here this didn't work. So program options, there's a variety of programs out in the United States. So there are 2-year clinical programs in private practice, and they can either be standalone in the larger private practices, for example, Landauer Medical Physics, or sometimes you find hub and spoke models where smaller private practice groups have teamed up with a larger nearby university so that the residents get their main training in private practice and come to the university for didactics and training in modalities that is not available at private practice. There are also 2-year clinical programs in academic practice. We also have what we call kind of a mixed academic model in some academic residency training programs. Most of the times they are 3-year programs which have 2 years of residency and 1 year of research or postdoc. And a very few universities like Memorial Sloan Kettering Cancer Center in New York, they have 4 years. So you do 2 years of residency and 2 years of research postdoc. In terms of the application process, where to apply, generally 2 areas. One is the AAPM MPRAP software, or sometimes institutions are required to use their institution-specific software. So when positions get posted, they usually state which one to use. There's also 2 options with the match. There's some programs, actually a majority of programs these days, which participate in the match. And there are also programs which hire outside of the match. Some programs even do both. They hire their 1st of July residency starts in the match, and then they have maybe a January start that they hire outside the match, or they just hire some of their residency positions from the match. So MPRAP and match are separate programs. So to find the APM MP Wrap, you go to the APM website and you click on Education, and you will find a link there to the Medical Physics Residency Application program. It has actually a very good user interface to register and tell you all the different pieces of your application that you need to collect, for example, transcripts and personal statements, letters of reference, and all these items. It's really well organized. So what makes you stand out in your application? So the first thing a lot of residency directors look at is the candidate statement. So what we want to tease out is, like Dr. McNiven said, do you know what you get into? What the field is about? Do you understand what we do in therapy physics? And also, can you communicate well? If you have a few grammar errors in there, well, not ideal, but happens. Lots of us speak English as a second language. Spelling, well, we have software to fix spelling. So if you don't use it and you have that in your candidate statement, think about that impression. So try to polish it up as much as you can. Next, reference letters are really, really important. So if you do a PhD and there is no letter from your immediate PhD advisor, it kind of makes us wonder. We realize that some advisors inexplicably cannot get their letters in time, and we don't want to punish students for that because it's really outside of their control. But it does prompt us to pay extra scrutiny to your application. If you don't do a PhD, if you're a master's or in the United States a certificate student, letters from recent lecturers. If you're coming from industry or have worked before, a former supervisor is also a good reference as long as it is recent. If references are older than 3 years or even 2 years, it kind of is also a reason for concern, because we're starting to wonder why there is no one more recent who has worked with you who would want you to give a reference. Transcripts, oh, this is incomplete. Yeah, transcripts are check that they're present. That's what the P is for, that they have a decent grade. Don't need to be perfect. Decent is enough, because classroom learning doesn't always transfer to clinical expertise one-on-one, and that you have the required classes. I always get asked about publications. For PhD students, of course, we check how productive you have been, because that is part of your PhD. For master students, publications are nice to have, but are really not mandatory, because that's not the role of what you do in your master's. In terms of, I don't know why the animations don't show up properly. I tested them before. My apologies. So what makes you stand out in your application? There are some smaller items that could differentiate between otherwise equally qualified candidates. So if you are eligible for ABR Part 1, have you taken it and passed it? Are you a double APM or comp student member? If you're not, I'm kind of asking myself, why are you really interested in that field if you don't interact or a member of your professional organization? And I also do look for outside activities that can demonstrate leadership or team skills. And for example, I had a resident who was a French horn player in an orchestra. It clearly requires team skills. I had a resident who worked as a mountaineering guide for a while, and you can appreciate how that person has very good interpersonal skills. Any other volunteer activities, really. So the elephant in the room, and there's actually discussion on the medical physics Reddit on that, is if you have a DUI or another record. This is purely personal response to that. There, by the grace of God, many of us did stuff as teenagers or young adults we rather not admit to, now that we're a little bit more mature. So it could have been us. And honestly, some of us got caught doing that stuff, some did not. Where we ended up on this, getting caught and cited for it or not, is often strongly influenced by bias and structural issues in societies. I think a lot more residency directors starting to realize that. I personally could get away with a lot more things than people who maybe look, behave, and talk differently. And, and it doesn't really make a difference in the candidate. But if you do have a record, don't attempt to hide it. We all run background checks before hiring, and if it comes out at that point, it's really bad for you. If you do have it, address it directly in your cover letter and application. It shows that you're honest and admitting mistakes, which is actually a point in your favor. We want you to demonstrate what you've learned from it. It's also important, and convince us that you are, trustworthy, and it's something in your past. We actually have interviewed and ranked candidates with a record because they were able to convince us of the 3 points, and we felt that, yeah, it was just something stupid they did when they were 17, and we shouldn't really hold that against them now in their mid-20s. So interviews from the residency director perspective. My institution will probably offer face-to-face and virtual beyond 2022, because we realize that the cost of travel is a barrier to good candidates to come out to us in California and see us, and we don't want that to be a barrier. So more and more programs are doing that. We did a mixed interview option where some residents came to us and some had a virtual interview, and we found no difference in candidate ranking, actually. So what we're looking for in good candidates: introverts, extroverts, doesn't really matter. We've had both in our residency program. So don't be afraid to be yourself, as Dr. McNiven said. It's really just important that you can communicate well. And, a lot of our faculty are English as second language speakers, myself included. So having an accent is fine. It's just, are you able to get your point across? Can you tell a story in a logical manner? I also try to tease out from the candidates, have you actually looked at our website to learn about us? Do you have kind of an overview of how big our center is, who's there, what the program is about? 20 minutes the night before interview really should do that. And I also look for, and Dr. McNiven also alluded to that, is, do you know what you're looking for in a program? Are you more hands-on clinically inclined? Do you want to have a strong research component? Programs in the US vary much in size. We have the big programs like MD Anderson that are the size of Princess Margaret. And then we have the smaller programs like ours. And not everybody fits in every program. So from the candidate perspective, I'd also like to share a few things that you can do during your interview to find the right program for you. First of all is separate the brand name from content. It is very hard. You have this shiny object of a really famous program, and you're very tempted to say, yes, I have to get it. I have to take that if they offer. But it actually may not be the right program for you. A famous name is not useful to you if it means years of feeling like you're not really fitting in, because that impacts your learning. And at the end of the 2 years, you're actually in a worse position getting your career started, as if you had maybe not taken the brand name program, but a program that really fits you as a person, as a medical physicist better. So please keep that in mind. During the interview, pay attention how faculty interact with each other and with staff and with you. You can tell a lot about the day-to-day interaction by, are they relaxed? Are they joking with each other? Do they cover each other when clinic interrupts an interview? Just get the vibe for that. Also look at how the residents at that program interact with faculty. Is it a interaction that you feel like, yes, that's how I want to be supported, or an interaction that you think this would be challenging for me? Very important. Are you given the chance to speak to the existing residents without any faculty present? If not, I would consider that a big red flag. You know, I feel very strongly about this, as you can tell. And lastly, also location, life outside work. Right now, travel has been challenging in the last 2 years, and some residents really need the support of family and friends relatively nearby. Others are okay without that and just Zooming. So really examine yourself and make sure you know what you need in that regard, also in life outside your work. Whatever gives you joy and refreshes you, make sure you end up in a place where you can actually do that. Because if you don't, it's going to be a more challenging 2 years than it needs to be. Switching over to the match. So now you've interviewed, you have a list of programs. There is actually a very nice website on the National Matching Services that explains how the match works and has actually a really nice YouTube video on it to explain the details. It also posts the rules on the match website. The most important one for you to consider is, if you decide to take an offer outside the match, you must retract your application before the rank list submission deadline. So if you don't, and you do match with a program and you've already accepted another job, it's really a very difficult situation for everybody involved. Ranking, I always recommend rank programs in true order of preference. And again, what Dr. McNiven said, think about what you need. You want to be in academic or private practice? What's the size of the program that would work for you? What's the training style that works for you? And where's the location? And a number of other issues. Don't rank the program if you don't really want to train somewhere, because if you match, you're committed. There's really no gaming the system. Forget about all kinds of games. Just rank them like you want them. Institutions do the same. We rank in order of candidate preference. We don't try to guess where candidates might rank us. It's just, that's just wasted time. A very few candidates will not be ranked, and it takes really a whole lot to end up there. I have some war stories not to be shared here, but just be conscientious about being professional when you and respectful when you interview somewhere. And with that, I want to thank you for your time. Again, apologize for some of the technical glitches, and of course, wishing you success in securing a residency spot either this year or one of the following years, whenever it fits your career.
All right, thanks so much for that presentation. Wow, both of those presentations worked really well together, despite not talking to each other before. So we'll now open the panel and open discussion period. And during this time, we do encourage you to turn on your cameras if you want, but please remain mute and raise your hand if you have a question. Then I'll ask you to unmute, and you're also more than welcome to ask questions in the chat, and I can read them to our speakers. So to open the discussion, we would also like to welcome 2 medical physics residents to the panel, Dr. Svetlana Kuzetnova and Nathan Murtha, Dr. Nathan Murtha, to the panel discussion. And to provide a better context to the audience, would you please introduce yourself, including your current residency position, your past program, and provide really a short overview of your medical physics residency application process. So Svetlana, if you could start, that would be great.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, first, thanks for that sort of brief introduction as well, Claire. So my name is Svetlana Kuznetsova. I did my PhD at University of Calgary, that's in Alberta, Canada. So the PhD program that I did was very interesting because it was a sort of an academic program. However, we also had a lot of hands-on medical experience as well. So for example, the graduate students at the University of Calgary do a lot of QA like monthly on their own, which is very, very unique. So then when I undergone the match, sort of the MedPhys match and the residency interview process last year, it was a very interesting experience because it was all virtual. And for me personally, so I would say about halfway through my PhD, I really wanted to get a residency in the States because mainly I wanted to see sort of the contrast between two different sort of the medical systems, but also because I have been told personally that it is a sort of a good idea to see how other centers work as well, versus just one. So perhaps even the residency directors could comment on that later. I just saw the message from Magdalena. But it's so I primarily interviewed at the American centers, but I also interviewed at the few Canadian ones as well, that I was really interested in as well. So, and because of COVID, I also wasn't really sure what the situation would be. Like, would they even take Canadian applicants? Because is it going to be easy to get a visa? But luckily it all worked out and I ended up here at UC San Diego.
Awesome, thanks, Svetlana. Nathan, do you want to give an introduction?
Yeah, absolutely. So my name's Nathan Murtha. I'm a new resident at the Tom Baker Cancer Center in Calgary. And I actually did my PhD at Carleton University, which is in Ottawa, Canada. My path here is maybe a little less traditional medical physics. I did study medical physics, but my project was actually in radiological security, so it wasn't clinical. But with that being said, I ended up out in Calgary anyway. And I was interested in staying in Canada, though I did chat with a couple centers in the States. I ended up applying to both the medical physics match program and a couple centers outside of the match program. And I think that's my brief intro.
Awesome, thanks so much. So if anyone has questions for any of our panelists, feel free to raise your hand or write it in the chat. But I could start with a question. So you did mention the interview process for these residency applications, and I was actually curious if applicants should prepare for technical questions during the interviews, and kind of a two-part question to that. And the second being, what would be the best response if the applicant doesn't really know the answer, and how could they recover from that?
So I generally don't ask technical questions unless it's about the interviewee, the candidate's PhD project. You know, for let's say if you working on some cone beam CT research project, I might ask you something about that. Otherwise, I think there's very few things I would ask unless you bring a specific technology up and initiate a conversation.
I'd say that's similar for us, although we do ask some questions that we don't view necessarily sometimes as technical, but are looking for kind of insight into that clinical awareness. So, questions about how how someone might handle, a certain clinical situation. We know you're not clinically trained, so it's more kind of the interpersonal, like there's, a scenario between a therapist and an RO and the physicist, what might you do? We don't expect, a right answer. We're looking to see, are you aware at all of, dynamics in the clinic or scope of practice about a medical physicist, and insight into where an applicant might be with respect to that. I don't think we typically don't ask questions except for, as Dr. Dieterich said, in kind of the presentation component. And that's why we've kept a 10-minute research presentation, is so we can see your project and ask some questions there and see how you can summarize the technical info. I know certainly programs in Ontario I've heard of do ask technical questions. I think, it would be, my perspective, if you haven't studied, you could say, I know I did cover that in this course. This is what I would look up. I don't remember the details, but I know this, this, and this. And maybe what can you draw on and how your fundamentals can go, but know when to say no. And I don't want someone, who is maybe overconfident or dangerous. So I think, being honest about your knowledge and where you are is actually great insight into a candidate. So if you don't know the answer, just say you don't know. If there's no obvious things you can build on, just leave it there, in my perspective.
Is it okay if I jump in here as well, Claire?
Yeah, of course.
Yeah, so in my experience interviewing in the last sort of match cycle is that a lot of American residencies did have some technical questions. So just to give you some examples, I was asked as to how to calculate dose, how does the ion chamber work, what is the mass attenuation coefficient, what is the BD versus EQD2 equation. I even was asked what's the, I think it was for liver density, although to be fair, my research was liver SBRT. And then also I was asked things such as, more of like technical questions such as, you're doing a measurements late at night and you see that it's off, your measurements are off, it's in the action level zone, what would you do? And also I had someone like sort of show the ion chamber from a LINAC as well in front of like in the Zoom call and ask what it was, and was it sealed or open as well. So I had those questions asked, and I guess my advice would be it's a good of to have a little bit of a refresher, maybe review a little bit of con and addicts going into the sort of interviews. However, you're also, as was mentioned earlier, you're not going to know everything, and that's okay. Not everyone has sort of the clinical experience or seen like LINAC being taken apart where they know what if every little part is. And like it was mentioned, I guess what they are looking for if you don't know something is just to try and maybe just explain how would you what would you look up? What resources would you go to? It's okay if you don't know, for example, TG 142 tolerances by heart, that's okay. But again, not to be sort of overconfident and give like a wrong answer as well, I think was a very good advice. And that's what I would suggest students do.
Awesome, thanks so much. That's really good information to know. So I see that Shweta has a question.
Thank you for the great presentation. I have a question for Nathan. You said your project was not directly diagnosis or therapy related. Then what are some of the challenges you faced while applying for residency, and how did you overcome them? If you don't mind answering.
Not a problem at all. I think, to be honest, the biggest challenge I faced was doubt in my application because I wasn't clinical. I had worry about that, but it turned out, I actually ended up speaking with a couple of people who've been in the field for a while. A couple of them are program directors, and I was asking their perspective. I guess in short, the answer there is that it depends on the program director, what they think about this, but the overwhelming majority did not see that as a negative thing. So to get over that doubt, that was the biggest hurdle in my opinion. Other than that though, I did go through the CAMPEP stream. So what I really do is make sure that you're making it clear that you went through a CAMPEP accredited program or another equivalent, I guess. And probably within the interview, you want to make sure that you're expressing that you're bringing something valuable to the team. Even though you don't necessarily have clinical experience, you've gone through this graduate degree where you've learned some valuable skills, and you want to make sure that you're communicating that. And you can also emphasize that at the same time, you're coming with the necessary background to hit the ground running and learn with the rest of the team in the clinic.
All right, thanks so much, Nathan, for that. I see Amy has a question. Feel free to unmute. And then I'll go with questions in the chat. So don't worry, I see them.
Yeah, for sure. So Dr. Dieterich talked a little bit about tips and tricks on how to gauge whether a program is a good fit. I assume a lot of these things are a lot easier to do in person. So I was wondering if panelists could comment on tips and tricks to gauge whether a program is a good fit for a candidate when interviews and whatnot are conducted virtually.
I can start, and probably it's better for Svetlana and Nathan as well, since they've just gone through this. But I think thinking about your learning style, or how you learn and interact with people, and asking programs some questions about how they teach, how engaged you are in clinical activities, giving them to maybe a chance to talk more, meeting, as Dr. Dieterich said, with the current residents without the faculty there, finding out about their experience, and they've been hired, so finding out how their experience was in the process, and their experiences working with the faculty, and how the interactions work, could give you some insight into that, even virtually, in terms of conversation. But it is hard.
I think if I can jump in, I think one of the points that Dr. Dieterich mentioned was, at least in an in-person interview, you would try to see how you'd fit in with the people working there, and how they interact with each other and with the staff and everyone else. But if you're doing this remotely, maybe a way to do that would be if you end up joining 5 minutes early, and you're in that situation where you're sitting kind of with the video screens in front of you and nobody's talking. That could be a good time to try to get to know people. That's easier said than done, because your palms are probably sweating and you're probably nervous and you don't want to say anything silly, but that's a good time where you're potentially alone with staff members, and you could see how they interact with each other, or how they might interact with you. And then it's already been mentioned more than once now, but you should get a chance to still chat with the residents that are already in that program, and even virtually, that's a huge resource. So definitely take advantage of that. Come with questions for them, not just about the program, but about kind of like culture and life within the program.
Awesome, thanks so much. Dr. Dieterich, do you have anything to add to that question, or?
Yeah, I was thinking about, maybe if you're talking to one question you could ask is what the faculty and the residents would consider the most challenging part of the residency program. And those answers might tell you something.
Awesome, thanks. So we do have a question from the chat from Jocelyn. So Jocelyn asks, what advice do you give an undergraduate student considering pursuing medical physics? So how to decide if you're interested or not, and really how to start preparing at that stage. A very loaded question, but.
APM undergraduate summer fellowships. Apply for one of those, see if you can get in. That would be the, I think, best way to figure out, or any other internship you can get.
Yeah, similar. I think summer studentships, fourth year, like thesis projects. I know that's where I first started, was kind of an undergrad thesis project with a medical physicist. Ask for kind of, also in those opportunities, ask to engage or see what you can do to follow them in their day-to-day work too, and not just the research project, but see what they do on a day-to-day basis to get insight into the clinic, and see if that is for you or not. It is helpful as well.
I know that UC Davis has a course that gives, I think, 2 credits, and that's for a senior undergraduate, and they basically do that, follow us for QA, participate, give a presentation, and you actually get credits for that. So your university may actually offer that.
Awesome, thank you. So there's a question for Dr. McNiven. An international student is asking, how likely is it for an international student to get a residency position in Canada? You mentioned that the candidate pool is mainly people who are citizens and permanent residents. So
yeah, so it varies a bit by jurisdiction So I can comment on Ontario for sure, because that's where my experience is. Our funding that we have from some of the funding for the residency positions comes from the Ministry of Health. And the logistics are around that is it has to be a permanent resident of Canada or a Canadian citizen. So unless you come with your own funding somehow and it's outside like an extra position, it doesn't really work in our area. So different components in Canada do have different logistical issues that way, depending on the funding mechanism. But I can't comment specifically on all the details of the different areas right now, but it's something to be aware of.
Awesome, thank you so much. So we have time for a couple more questions. Laszlo, I see your hand is up. Feel free to unmute and ask.
Yeah, hi everyone. So yeah, I wanted to ask a question from Dr. Dieterich. So you mentioned that when we accept an offer from a program outside of the match, then to make sure that we hand in our withdrawal from the match before the deadline for the ranking submission. So I was wondering what the timeline is for these programs outside of the match program, because I know that for the match, they have very strict deadlines on by, what are the dates, but, would be guaranteed that we will get that offer before we have to submit the ranking for the match program?
No, and that is the challenge with that. Basically, those programs who hire outside the match, they are aware of that deadline, or they ought to be. I would hope that they are aware. And if not, you just need to bring that up to them and say, hey, if I need a signed offer on hand before I withdraw from the match. And be very aware if you only have a verbal agreement and you withdraw from the match and the program withdraws their offer, you're left hanging.
Right. Okay, thank you.
Awesome. Ali, do you want to ask your question?
Sure. First of all, thank you all for all your answers so far. It's been very insightful. My question is about students who are very early in their PhD careers, whose thesis maybe isn't as clinically focused and don't have visibility of, for example, the QA checks and things like that that physicists do. What opportunities would you suggest those students seek out in order to gain that experience?
So I'm assuming that it's a medical physics program and you are attached to a cancer center or some. So there's often opportunities to join physicists for QA, or maybe help with commissioning or an annual QA. And I think that is definitely sufficient. I don't expect significant time because I know how time intensive a PhD is to start with. So, but on the other hand, if somebody does a PhD and wants to go into medical physics and hasn't seen a clinic from the inside, I'm also a little bit skeptic about their commitment to the field. So yeah, definitely seek out some opportunities, but don't put too much time in it that is to the detriment of your PhD work.
Awesome. We're just out of time, but I have one more question from Andrea in the chat. So really at the end of the day, what would you say is the most important factor in choosing a residency versus like A or B? Acknowledging obviously this is personal, so if you're willing to share your own opinions.
Should I jump in on this one, Claire?
Go for it.
Yeah, so what is the deciding factor between choosing residency between A or B? Yeah, I mean, there's just so many factors that go into making that decision. I think just to sort of emphasize something that residency directors have already mentioned that I found was very important for me is that it's not a good idea. It's not the best idea to go to a place that you're not going to enjoy living in for 2 years was actually one of the advices that I got when I was going through match. And that's because, 2 years might not seem like a long time, but, you're not going to be as productive in the, because if you don't enjoy the place that you're at, you're not going to be just as productive. And then Also, for me personally, the vibe that you get from people when you're interviewing, it's pretty, it's pretty difficult to ignore certain vibes. Again, at the end of the day, one of the, again, advices that I got is the people do make or break a place where you want to do a residency. And if you get really good vibe from talking to fellow residents, from the faculty, I feel like that's very, very important as well, because I'm all about having a strong support system. For me, that was very important, because if I am not sure about something, or if I have a question, but I feel like it might be a dumb question, will I feel comfortable asking the faculty or fellow residents, or am I going to feel like I'm being like judged a little bit? So I would say definitely for me, choosing between A or B, it came down to what kind of vibe I got from the people of the residency program.
So we are out of time, but if there's any last minute thoughts by the panel, please feel free to say it. But if anyone has to leave right now, please feel free to leave as well. But thank you everyone so much for attending. The turnout was really great for the session. Nathan, did you want to make your comment as well? I feel like people find it very useful.
Yeah, regarding that last question, I was just going to say that I think everything Svetlana said is basically the first thing that came to my mind as well. The only thing I could even think to add to that would be, you might find that some programs offer sort of what I'll call like additional soft skill experiences, maybe, if that's the way to describe it. Like there might be aspects to their program that will support you in studying for the CCPM exam, or maybe the American equivalent. Or you might find that you get more exposure with the radiation oncology residents in one center than another. And you can learn these kind of things by either through a presentation from the director, or talking to the residents in that private discussion you get to have with them. So consider factors like that too. You might find there's just kind of other supporting mechanisms built into the program that are really appealing to you in your situation.
If like my last thoughts, if I could briefly mention some of the more like practical advice I would give. So around this time last year, to prep for the residency applications, what I did is I approached some of the residents and I asked if they were willing to share their MP rap statements and their CVs. And if they were comfortable sharing those, what I did is I compiled a bunch of them. I read through them in order to get an idea and a sense as to what my statement would look like. And one of the other advices that I would give is I did not have LinkedIn this time last year, but I ended up getting a LinkedIn when going through the residency programs. And what I found is that when you're interviewing, you're going to be interviewing with the same sort of fellow graduate students. So what we ended up doing, we ended up adding like each other on LinkedIn. And then on the day of the match, we ended up wishing each other like sort of good luck on matching, and then congratulating each other when we got matched. So it helps definitely. I felt it helped build kind of a sense of community, in the sense because you're the chances are you're going to see the fellow sort of graduate students you're going to be interviewing alongside with at conference and stuff. So that's also one of the practical advices that I would give to students.
Awesome. Thanks so much, everyone, for all of your advice that you gave to us. I feel that was very useful for a lot of us students. So if you guys have any more questions, feel free to email me and I can direct you to any of the contacts that you need. But yeah, thank you everyone for attending. We hope to see you next month on the first Friday of the month, same time, same link. Awesome.
Yeah, bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.